Monday, 16 November 2020. What are the possible institutional structures of science? Of course, the question begs the question of what science is. And we could just use our intuitive understanding of science, but the obvious problem here is, do we count the pursuit of knowledge prior to the scientific revolution as science, or do we only count modern science? So there were clear intimations of science before the scientific revolution. We have a few examples scattered, and always problematic, always just on the edge of whether you would identify them as science, true science or not. But that's what makes what I've called a loosely coupled STEM cycle, is precisely because it's scattered. It's not systematic. It's not coupled with other institutions in order to create a feedback loop and acceleration. But suppose we say, something like science since the scientific revolution, or it's the scattered instances of science prior to that more or less conform to that model. If we could, ideally, if we could create an ideal sequencing of his science and history, and we could eliminate all the dead space and bring together those scattered instances and have one, rapid succession of the growth of scientific knowledge. In that sense, science, what institutional structures can it take? And the motivation for my asking this question is, then how do we determine what are our criteria for determining the compatibility of the institution of science with other institutions, with other social institutions, with economic institutions, political institutions, educational institutions, and so on. Because if we look at the rise of natural science during the scientific revolution, it was something that happened largely outside of the universities, which had been dominated by scholastic philosophy and continued to be dominated by scholastic philosophy. So eventually the sciences took over the university system, but in the early days, and scientists even in the early days were often educated in universities, but they had to make a break with that in order to pursue their original research outside the university framework. So that early modern science as an institution was incompatible with the educational institution. Though today, the science that is the descendant of early modern science is compatible with contemporary educational institutions to a certain extent. There's certainly tensions, but science has more or less taken over the university system and refashioned it to its own ends. So what economic institutions and political institutions and social institutions are compatible with or not compatible with science? Is an agricultural economic infrastructure compatible with science? Is an industrialized economic infrastructure? Is a spacefaring economic infrastructure compatible with science? Religious institutions would be another obvious category of institutions we'd want to determine. This has been the conflict between science and religion has been a target of recent revisionist history, but there are certainly aspects in which early modern science was compatible with religious institutions and instances in which it was not compatible with religious institutions. So there was a tension, but there was also a certain degree of integration. And we can find that all over. We can say there was a tension with political institutions, but there are some overlap and some excluded areas that could not be brought together. I suppose a person of a progressive outlook would say that truly scientific institutions were only compatible with democratic political institutions and progressive social institutions and government institutions, etc. That's just an Enlightenment construction. We have no obligation to pretend as though this is the case. But there are several interesting questions here that could demand further attention, further work. How do we define science in an institutional sense? How do we determine whether science is compatible with social institutions, and whether it's compatible with the degree to which it's compatible, and whether if there are tensions and incompatibilities, how can they be addressed? How can they be? How can we work with them to still produce science in the midst of institutional conflict, I guess you could say. There's an historical aspect to these questions as well, because we might ask questions like, how long is the institution of science compatible with another institution? Because clearly, episodically sophisticated science was practiced within the context of societies with feudal political institutions and agricultural economic institutions. You could argue that the intermittency of science was in fact a function of the fact that a feudal political context and an agricultural economic context were insufficiently robust or insufficiently productive to support ongoing scientific research programs at the scale we know them today. But if we're going to deal honestly with these questions, then we'd also have to observe the extent to which Enlightenment ideology and the practical demands of industrializations has driven science away from a pure focus on science, driven us away, in a sense, from a scientific civilization, because it distracted us from taking science as an end in itself. And taking science as an end in itself, as a central project of a society, would be a scientific civilization. So even these economic and social and political institutions that seem to point to the ability to sustain something more than episodic science, these things, yes, they produce a lot of wealth, and it allows a lot of scientists to get educated and a lot of science to be done, but it also compromises science in myriad different ways. And we should observe that the origins of modern science don't take place in this context at all. The origins of science take place in late medieval, early modern Europe, with feudal institutions and an agricultural economic infrastructure. One could regard it as a mere historical accident that industrialized civilization ended up producing so much wealth that it could support vastly greater amounts of science than previous modes of civilization. And there are senses in which, as I just implied, that the Enlightenment and industrialization are overtly hostile to free scientific inquiry. Another way to drive this question further would be, working out elaborate variations on the theme of anything that we can find in human history. We can ask about science in the context of nomadic societies. Is there any circumstance under which you can have science in the context of hunter-gatherers, or even science in the context of horse nomads like the Mongols or Tamerlane or Genghis Khan or Attila the Hun, etc. Kenneth Clark noted that in these nomadic societies and in the disrupted society of early medieval Europe, where people were always on the move, that there were still a lot of craftsmen. There were craftsmen who were making swords and making jewelry, making portable things. And I often like to point out all the portable accessories that Vikings things carried with them, from cooking pots with stands that could be stood up on any ground, or beds that can be taken apart, and all that kind of thing. Clearly, these societies, if they became wealthy enough, could sustain science. Whether they could do so as well as industrialization is another question. But we could certainly imagine counterfactual scenarios in which alternative human societies could sustain scientific research programs. Another obvious example would be that of pastoral people, which are just one step away from nomadic peoples. But pastoral societies, say, if a whole planet were devoted to pastoralism and didn't develop agriculture, or societies that practice transhumance, you could have very different social structures, very different economic institutions, and still be at least as compatible with scientific institutions as the compatibility of today, or the compatibility during the conditions of scientific revolution.